I want to welcome everybody who has joined us today for the webinar and those who are still joining in. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you to this event, which is focused on the launch of two new publications on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, prepared by our own research fellow, Louis Reitmann. The two publications are covering, the first one is a history of multilateral efforts on PAROS from 1978 to nowadays, and a paper proposing a result-oriented and form-flexible approach to ensuring strategic stability and preventing armed conflict in space. The presentation of the publications will be followed by a panel discussion with leading experts reflecting on the achievements and remaining fault lines in PAROS process and potential way forward, including in the open-ended working group on PAROS in all its aspects. I'm not going to say more about the issue or the publications themselves because we want to make sure we have time to both have presentations from the speakers, first of all, the publications themselves, and also the discussion afterwards. And hopefully we'll have time for questions and answers session. I'll try to keep our speakers to the time limit that they received in advance. But in the meantime, I would encourage everyone who joined us to submit your questions through Q&A function. That's how we would know that you sent us a question. With that, let me quickly introduce our speakers today. The author of the two new publications and the main presenter is Louis Reitmann, who is our own VCDNP research fellow and who is the lead on the project on outer space security, and he will be presenting both of his papers today. Then we also have Noelle Riza Castillo, who is the director of the Space Policy and International Cooperation Bureau at the Philippine Space Agency, which has been guiding the Philippines' development as an emerging spacefaring nation since 2019, including on legal matters and activities with international counterparts. She also represented the Philippines in the governmental group of experts on further practical measures for PAROS in 23 and 24, and the open-ended working group on reducing space threats before that. Then we have Simon Cleobury, who is head of arms control and disarmament at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where he has been leading a series of dialogue meetings, workshops, and events around space security and PAROS. From 2017 and 2023, Simon was the UK's Deputy Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament, and crucially, he was closely involved in the Initiative for Norms of Responsible Behavior in Outer Space, as well as the open-ended working group on reducing space threats. And finally, Almudena, Azcárate Ortega, who is the lead space security researcher at UNIDIR. She has published widely on space security law and policy and has represented her research in UN processes on PAROS and many other international fora. Almudena recently completed her PhD in space security law at Georgetown University. The PhD is focused on the distinction between dual use and dual purpose space system. And congratulations, Almudena. We're very happy for you to finish this big milestone. So with that, the way we're gonna do is I'll first invite Louis to say a few words about the project and briefly introduce the first paper. Louis, the microphone is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you so much to everybody joining us online. I'm really pleased to be with you here today for what is quite the momentous occasion in VCDNP history as we're launching our first ever publications on space, and not just one, but two publications on space security and PAROS. Um, as Elena said, these two publications are part of a wider research and engagement project that I've had the pleasure of leading since June, and which will keep us busy into next spring. And there'll be more research, more dialogue activities under that project through which we're aiming to support states to make progress on space security. For example, at the end of this month, we'll be organizing a Track 1.5 workshop with Simon and our friends at the GCSP in Geneva, bringing together people from capitals, diplomats, space industry, and experts. Then, of course, we're looking forward to sharing more about the results of our work and further engaging with the diplomatic community on PAROS at key forums like the upcoming First Committee meeting in New York, but of course also the further sessions of the OEWG on PAROS in all its aspects. And then finally, there'll be a more detailed, more comprehensive publication looking at emerging norms and standards on space security that we'll release next spring. And I think that that'll be a really useful and actionable contribution to the work of the OEWG. So the bottom line is that there's more coming from the VCDNP on space security. If that interests you, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website to be informed about our events and publications. You can, of course, follow us on X and LinkedIn. And if that's not enough for you, if you want to engage more directly, more closely, I'd love to have a chat with you, and you're welcome to reach out to me directly. My email address is also on the website. Um, so just to say a little bit of that about the project. And before I actually move to talking about the papers, I want to say a big thank you to the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for generously funding this project and allowing us to make a contribution to PAROS. But I also want to say thanks to our great panelists that we'll have here today. Thanks for joining us, especially to Almudena and Noelle, because it is particularly late in their time zones. So I appreciate it even more. Thank you for being with us. I'm sure the audience appreciates it too, and will pose only the most excellent and thought-provoking questions in the Q&A. I have to say another thanks to Almudena and her colleague Sarah Erickson, both at UNIDIR, for lending their expertise, their experience, their advice and input on this project, in particular these two publications. I'm going to just quickly share my screen to show you some of the slides that I have prepared. Here we go. So before I actually introduce the two papers, I want, for those who may be completely new to the PAROS issue, give just a very quick and dirty explanation of where it comes from and why it matters. So during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union developed anti-satellite weapons and even tested nuclear weapons in space, seeking the ability to destroy each other's satellites because satellites perform critical functions for military operations on Earth, like communication, navigation, and early warning of missile launches. And there's an exclamation mark on that one because this is where space and nuclear deterrence intersect. These developments showed that an arms race, or worse, conflict in outer space, could undermine strategic stability and potentially lead to escalation here on Earth. It was the realization that conflict in space probably wouldn't stay in space. But it also highlights that there are dangers to the peaceful uses of space that our modern societies and economies absolutely rely on, from things like global shipping and air traffic to climate change monitoring, facilitating financial transactions, enabling humanitarian aid and disaster response. For all of these purposes, space-based services and technologies are essential. So clearly protecting them is very important. And although the Outer Space Treaty bans the placement, stationing, and installation of weapons of mass destruction in space, states have yet to agree on further measures to keep space secure. And that's what PAROS is all about. That's why it's important. That is what the discussions are about. So this provides a really neat segue for me to actually introduce the first paper to you, the history of PAROS. It's really straightforward. It sort of does what it says on the tin. It is a comprehensive summary of all of the multilateral processes on PAROS that we've had, ranging back to 1978 with the UN General Assembly Special Session Report, which mentions PAROS for the first time as sort of the foundation of PAROS, of the PAROS concept, all the way through 40 plus years later to today with the July session of the OEWG on PAROS in all its aspects. And as you can see in this nifty little graphic here that's also included in the paper, we are covering 10 of these multilateral processes, and there's a section on each of them. Each section provides information on mandates, the content of discussions, outcomes, and importantly, the substantive and the political issues, questions, disagreements that have affected these processes and unfortunately often have prevented consensus outcome documents. What I think the paper is particularly good at, if I do say so myself, is to explain why what happened happened. So it explains historical context, it explains political background, and it's that kind of information that is really useful for diplomats to understand, but that's not as easy to glean from official documents on the UN websites. And with that, I hope that it'll be a really useful resource for the diplomats in Geneva as a refresher on PAROS, but also for our core audience here in Vienna, the Vienna diplomatic community, the COP US delegates, many of whom I know are really interested in learning more about what their colleagues are doing in Geneva, and indeed what they have been discussing for the past 40 plus years. So hopefully an all-around useful resource. So this shall just serve as a brief introduction to the first paper, and I will later talk more about the second paper. And I think as the author, I can say that that one is the more exciting, the more juicy one that I hope you'll stay tuned for. What I'm not going to do is rattle down the different processes one by one and kind of give you the Wikipedia entry on each of them. That'd be quite a boring lecture, and we don't do that at the VCDNP. But that's why I'm even more glad that we're joined by Almudena today, as you know, one of the world's leading experts on space security law and policy, who'll be able to share more on this, sort of her big picture analysis of the last 40 plus years of PAROS. And with that, I'm handing back to you, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. But you already kind of made a transition to and introduced Almudena's presentation. And indeed, from somebody who has been following these issues and observing some of the meetings, and we're really eager to hear from you and your assessment of the processes, kind of a big picture, where we are, what are the key issues, divisions, and we can go from there afterwards. Almudena, please.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you so much, Louise. It's great to be here. Thank you to the VCDNP for having me today. It was such a pleasure and a privilege to get to read the work that you did, Louise, on these papers, and I really encourage everybody to read them. So the task of going through maybe not the Wikipedia rundown of these processes has fallen to me. I hope I will make it not boring. But I do have some slides. They don't contain too much text, but hopefully they will help in guide the discussion a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. There we go. Let me put it in presentation mode. And if you could give me a thumbs up to make sure that you can see my screen, perfect. Okay. So I will be providing you an overview of PAROS, so essentially a bird's eye view. I will not get into the nitty-gritty of every single item that Louis highlighted in that beautiful graph that he had in his slides. But I will give you some key highlights, hopefully, that you will find interesting. As you, Louis, have already said, the whole discussion about space security is not new at all. In fact, it is one of the oldest discussions that we've been having when it comes to outer space exploration in general. And here you can see a graph that it very much started when we first reached out for the stars for the very first time with Sputnik 1. But the concept of PAROS emerged a little bit later officially, that was in 1978 during the first special session on disarmament. And since then, we have had PAROS as the sort of agenda item under which we discuss space security more generally. PAROS, by the way, for those not familiar with the UN acronym, stands for the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. Very soon after that special session of the UN General Assembly on disarmament, in fact, a couple of years later, in 1981, we had the first two resolutions on PAROS. The first one of those, the one on the top, focused on the negotiation of an effective and verifiable agreement to prohibit anti-satellite systems, and it prohibited the banning of these systems designed to impair the functioning or the interference or damage of satellites. The second resolution focused on the promotion of the negotiation of a legally binding agreement prohibiting the stationing of weapons, including conventional weapons, in orbit, because as you might know, the Outer Space Treaty only prohibits the stationing, the installation, or the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but it doesn't really say anything about conventional weapons. It does make a reference to conventional weapons for celestial bodies, but it doesn't really say anything about it when it comes to operational orbit, which is where human space activities happen the most. Some states called for these two resolutions, to be merged into one. But this was unfortunately not possible because the main sponsors felt very strongly about the distinct missions of each resolution. So this division essentially has marked the history of PAROS in one way or another through the years. PAROS was later on added to the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament for the first time in 1982, and then consultations were taken by the CD president in 1983 and 1984 to determine if an agreement could be achieved on the establishment of an ad hoc group on the CD on PAROS. Again, I will note the publication that Louis already introduced, because you can see the mention to be this ad hoc group there as well. So in 1985, this ad hoc group was established with a mandate to examine as a first step through substantive and general consideration, issues relevant to the preventions of an arms race in outer space. And it translated into a program of work that looked essentially into three main topics: the consideration of issues relevant to PAROS, existing agreements relevant to PAROS, as well as proposals and future initiatives for PAROS. Again, in this discussion, we saw a lot of differing views on the place and the priority that the committee should place on these issues, and an agreement was not able to be reached. And this disagreement persisted through the years. And through the research that we've conducted into all of these discussions and all of these proposals that have been made through the years, we've kind of identified the two main reasons why an agreement has not been able to be reached, and why success when it comes to issues of PAROS and space security more generally have been limited at best. And I would categorize them in these two simple terms. There's been disagreement when it comes on what we should be banning or what should we be limiting, as well as how we should be banning or limiting. And this discussion has maybe evolved over the years, become a little bit more modern, but in a way that disagreement persists to this day. There are certain states which prefer to focus on banning capabilities, where there are other states who prefer to focus on how those capabilities are being used, or how we call them behaviors. Then also there is the disagreement on how to ban. There are certain states who prefer legally binding agreements, and there are other states who prefer non-legally binding mechanisms. It should be said that none of these alternatives should be seen as mutually exclusive. In fact, they are all very complementary. And this is something that, especially in recent years and recent discussions, such as the OEWG on responsible behaviors and the more recent GD on further practical measures, has been recognized by states, that these are complementary and can happen at the same time and support one another. So that's also something that I would urge everybody in the audience to bear in mind, especially states who might be listening in, to take that complementarity into consideration when they take these discussions to the first committee, which is right around the corner, or the currently ongoing open-ended working group on PAROS in all its aspects. So let's talk a little bit about the what Louis called the Wikipedia rundown of initiatives. Again, I will not cover every single initiative that exists, but I do want to give a few important highlights that have helped shape the discussions, and that continue to be relevant to this day, even though some did actually happen quite a few years ago. The first one that I would like to highlight is the so-called PPWT, which was firstly introduced in 2008 by the Russian Federation and China. PPWT stands for a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, as well as the prohibition of the use and threat of use of force. This proposal essentially laid out 14 articles that might be used in a legally binding instrument, including the undertaking of states that they would not place in orbits around the Earth any objects carrying any kinds of weapons, and they would not resort to the threat or use of force against outer space objects. In 2014, a new version of this initiative was presented with amendments to the first 2008 version, after the Russian Federation and China received feedback from states. However, it never became an actual treaty. To this day, it continues to be a draft treaty, because there are certain certain issues that were never that states never managed to reach consensus on, such as, for example, the issue of verification. There are many states for whom having an effective verification mechanism is something that's very important, and the PPWT didn't include such a proposition. But to this day, this document continues to be very relevant, and there are certain states that propose that a future legally binding agreement could use this PPWT as a basis. Also, between the 2010 and the 2020, we had several groups of governmental experts. Firstly, in 2013, we had a GD on transparency and confidence building measures. Now, this GD didn't directly and uniquely refer to PAROS, but it was very much relevant for PAROS. And it did actually manage to reach a consensus report, which recommended a series of voluntary measures to reduce military tension in space and to increase transparency. And it included measures such as the sharing of information, notification of certain space activity. Also, the Disarmament Commission, which is another disarmament forum which meets in New York, has actually adopted an agenda item on this issue, and it issued recommendations in 2023 to be able to implement the recommendations of this GDE. Another GDE was convened in 2018 and 2019. The name of this GDE was the GDE on the further practical measures for PAROS, which sought to provide recommendations on advancing a legally binding instrument on the issue of PAROS. Unfortunately, this group didn't manage to reach the consensus needed for a report, but it did make a lot of headway in terms of recognizing the applicability of international law, particularly the Charter of the United Nations to outer space. And essentially, it continued to advance discussions on this topic. Then we move on to 2020, where the UK launches a new proposition, which is a shift of focus from capabilities to behaviours. And it introduces this idea of looking at norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours in order to reduce threats to space systems. This proposal became a proposal for an open-ended working group on this issue of reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. As you can see, the shift from a GDE, which is a closed group, to an OEWG, which is an open group to all states as well as non-governmental actors, was something very novel for PAROS discussions. We've never had an open discussion on this issue until this first OEWG on responsible behaviours. So that was quite a novel approach that was very much appreciated, especially by emerging spacefaring states and even non-spacefaring states, which are very much realizing that they might not be spacefaring themselves, but they are nevertheless stakeholders when it comes to space services. Now, this OEWG didn't manage to reach the consensus for a report, but the chair issued a summary of the proceedings under his own authority, which captured the key items of the discussions and which I would urge you to check out. And despite the fact that this OEWG didn't reach a consensus report, it did manage to advance discussions. And one highlight of the discussion that we saw here is that approach in terms of the discussion on the complementarity between legally and non-legally binding mechanisms that I was referring to before. Both states that have been supportive of either measures actually recognize the complementarity between them, and the fact that them being conceived as mutually exclusive is actually a false dichotomy. Another highlight of this process was the introduction of a unilateral commitment by the United States, where it urged states to commit not to test destructive direct descent ASATs. The US made that commitment itself and also encouraged others to make that commitment as well. And so far, 38 states have made their own commitment, and this was actually a measure that became multilateralized through a General Assembly resolution in 2023. Then we move on to another GDE on further practical measures for PAROS, which again, it bears the same name as the other GDE of 2019 that I just mentioned. But this GDE actually managed to reach a consensus report. And this is quite the historic achievement because it's the first consensus document that we have on the issue of PAROS. And Noelle will probably talk a little bit more about it later, maybe. So I won't talk too much about it. but I will say that this GD recapped a lot of the discussions that had happened before, even those discussions that never managed to reach a consensus document. But this recap essentially highlights that we have to think of PAROS as a series of building blocks rather than thinking of PAROS as a blank slate that renews itself every single time that we start talking about it. And I think that's really important. It also highlighted the importance of terminology and verification. And in terms of the importance of terminology, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart as a researcher, and the work that we do at UNIDIR, where we seek to promote common understanding when it comes to commonly used terms in space security. So that was wonderful to see that that this was highlighted in the discussions of the GD. Several other issues were discussed, but I don't want to go too deeply into the topic because I know we are short on time, and I don't want this to become too boring. So I will move on to the most recent process on PAROS, which is the OEWG on PAROS in all its aspects. This is an open-ended working group that's currently ongoing. It had its second substantive session this summer in July. So it's only just started, but this OEWG came about because it resulted because of a merger of two different initiatives. So even though when it comes to PAROS, there is this tradition of two different views that don't quite, manage to marry each other, I think we sort of broke the curse a little bit with this OEWG. And so the way that it came to be was that there was a proposal for an OEWG on responsible behaviors, which would continue the discussions from the 2023 OEWG by the same name. And then there was another proposal for an OEWG on further practical measures for PAROS, which would continue the discussions of the GD of that same name. Both OEWGs were approved, were adopted by the General Assembly, and they would be happening, at least part of them would be happening during the same years. So a lot of delegations were actually really concerned that these two processes were going to interfere with one another, and this would place a huge burden on many delegations, especially smaller ones, so who maybe would have to choose. Do I go to this OEWG? Do I go to this other one? Multiple states led by Egypt and Brazil supported the merger of these two OEWGs into one. And this was adopted through a decision at the General Assembly last year in 2024, leading to the establishment of this one OEWG. I have to highlight, though, that even though this was a great victory in terms of moving forward, still we have to admit that the geopolitical climate continues to be rather tense, and space is not a realm far away from what happens on Earth. Space policy, space law, space multilateralism is very much connected to the reality of geopolitics on Earth. So the fact that tensions exist down here also impact the discussions when it comes to space, which has made discussions at this OEWG a little bit difficult. During the first substantive session, a discussion centered on procedural issues, and it was difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But we were lucky that in this last session that happened in July, we actually started to have a substantive discussion, and it is my hope that we will continue this substantive discussion in the sessions that will be happening in 2026. Also, to wrap up, I want to highlight unilateral commitments. I talked already about the destructive DA-ASAT one, but there is another unilateral commitment that's also very relevant, which is the no first placement of weapons in outer space. This was a commitment that was first introduced by the Russian Federation in 2004. And since then, 33 states have pledged a similar commitment. And it's also an initiative that has been multilateralized. So as you can see, initiatives for PAROS can take many shapes and forms. They can be multilateral, they can be regional, they can be unilateral. and they can be for legally binding and non-legally binding mechanisms. They can focus on capabilities, they can focus on behaviors, but all of them can work together to achieve that goal of PAROS. So even though this slide is not very fancy, when I was preparing it, I thought of it as a sort of a bit of a house. You have the different bricks that form the house that is PAROS, and I would encourage states to think of that series of building blocks that we need to achieve PAROS, rather than a need to reinvent the wheel or in any other way try to use each new initiative as a blank slate. I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. And once again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Almudena, and it's indeed a very good message towards the delegations and those participating in all these different groups, forums, and other initiatives. For the sake of time, we will not open now any questions for Almudena or Louis on the first paper. We'll do it at the very end, after both papers are presented and we hear from other panelists. Just a reminder, I already saw some questions are posed in the Q&A. Please use it if you have questions, but as our speakers present, then you may adjust your questions. They may have addressed some of them in their presentation. And now to paper number 2, which Louis promised is much more exciting and has some novel approaches to how to move forward on these issues. Louis, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Elena. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, all looks good.
Perfect. So, while the first paper was more of an information source, more of a reference document, the second paper is more of a working paper, if you will, with many different proposals and recommendations for states. And you can see that it kind of has a 3-way structure there. So that's also how I'm going to be presenting it. So before I introduce the results-oriented and form-flexible approach that I pitch in the paper, I'll briefly talk about where we're starting from, just to connect to what Almudena was just presenting, the status quo and PAROS, and the recent injection of momentum through norms of responsible behavior. And at the end, I'll share just some of the priorities and concrete actions that I recommend states consider on PAROS. So moving on. Starting with the positives, states have achieved consensus on some key points. For example, existing international law applies to space. We have consensus on that. And transparency and confidence building measures can help us get to a PAROS treaty, another consensus item. However, despite over 40 years of dialogue, little has moved in the views on adopting a treaty, and discussions are still marked largely by issues that first emerged in the 1980s, like, is it possible to define what space weapons are, and how do we verify a ban on space weapons? The constant competition between a legally binding and non-binding approach makes it really difficult for states to flexibly and constructively explore topics. Precious time is often eaten up by procedural arguments. We saw that in the OEWG this year, as Almudena mentioned, which couldn't start talking substance for several months because of this. And that's what I call opportunity cost. Ultimately, this stagnation on substance and the duplication of work in competing bodies that are being set up, or sort of separate tracks, which we now have in the new OEWG, disadvantage states that don't have as many staff and whose staff have to cover many more files, especially developing countries. They also disincentivize states from investing the political capital into PAROS processes needed to forge agreement. and they disincentivize experts and industry from engaging in PAROS processes. So you'll see based on that, it's not by chance that I've chosen sort of the shape of a vicious cycle to represent what has been happening or not happening on PAROS. What has disrupted this sort of back and forth between the two legacy approaches has been the UK Initiative for Norms of Responsible Behavior. And I won't say much about this as Almudena has already done so, but just to highlight again some key achievements of that initiative and the OEWG on reducing space threats, it achieved a better shared understanding of the threats facing us in space. It helped to diversify the range of countries participating in PAROS discussions and show that space security isn't just for the space powers. All countries have a stake in and a voice on space security. And of course, it also promoted the complementarity between legally binding and voluntary measures. So, given the rather poor outlook, if we continue as before, and building on that progress we made in the OEWG on reducing space threats, the paper suggests that states should adopt a results-oriented and form-flexible approach. But what does that mean? A results-oriented approach acknowledges that states don't have to wait for consensus on either legacy approach to make progress. It argues that neither insisting on one particular treaty nor rejecting any legally binding instruments can deliver an effective space security regime. So instead, it encourages states to adopt concrete and effective measures that reduce space threats, unilaterally and with partners. These measures should be based on principles already identified in PAROS processes, like transparency, verifiability, and they can be anchored in existing space law, for example, the principles of due regard and avoiding harmful contamination in the Outer Space Treaty, which would ensure that states can act with agility and flexibility while firmly remaining on the ground of existing space law and reinforcing that. Form-flexible. Why form-flexible? Because this approach doesn't predetermine whether states should adopt legally binding or voluntary measures. States may find that some threats are more suitable to one and others to the other. They could also design combinations of both with a legally binding agreement and supporting declarations that provide additional detail to help flesh out and operationalize the often broad language used in treaties. To make sure that individual measures adopted reduce threats in a focused way, states should adopt them as what I call threat reduction pathways. You can think of these as sort of vertical sequences of steps, like a staircase, building on each other. For example, a declaration of norms and principles, which guides the development and implementation of threat reduction measures, followed by their codification in a treaty. But they could also be horizontal, with several steps at the same level. So if we take unauthorized proximity operations as an example, states could adopt operational standards that define when proximity operations present a threat, and at the same time, they could improve space object registration practices and enhance crisis communication. These three measures together address different elements of what can make proximity operations dangerous, but working together from different angles help to reduce this threat. While emphasizing the agency of states to act flexibly, including outside of UN bodies, multilateral forums are remaining as indispensable under a results-oriented approach, because next to many other functions, this is where states can explore how to harmonize the measures they adopt, so that standards, policies, instruments that enjoy broad support and have proven effective can be translated into a treaty. The membership of that treaty could be expanded over time, as has been the case with all space treaties. Now, I realize that adopting a new approach can seem daunting and can be really challenging. But in thinking about a new approach or sticking with the status quo, states should consider the risk that failing to produce concrete wins for space security may reduce the relevance of PAROS processes over time, with states potentially seizing participation at senior levels or divesting political capital. This shall just serve as a summary of the approach that I suggest in the paper. But I also want to mention another proposal that the paper kind of puts on the table for states to consider, and that is to update the framing for space security efforts to something new. Because when we look at PAROS stemming from 1978, that concept doesn't fully capture today's space domain. You see, 50 years ago, space was dominated by military satellites and a handful of countries. Today, space is host to many countries and is overwhelmingly used for peaceful purposes. Between 1957 and 1990, only 4% of launched objects were commercial. In 2023, the number was 90%. And this change has also created new types of threats that we're faced with. And while the content of our discussions on PAROS has somewhat adapted to this, the concept guiding us, the guiding star, if you will, has stayed the same. So to better reflect the new reality, states could consider a framing around the protection of peaceful uses of space. As I said, it already better reflects the reality of space today and tomorrow, but it is also directly rooted in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Outer Space Treaty. And it better reflects the priorities of global South countries, which we should remember are the majority of space end users on Earth. And they attach great importance to free and equal access to space, to the opportunity to grow their space economies, to benefit from the peaceful uses of space now and in the future, and of course, to keep space secure for those peaceful applications. But this shouldn't be seen as incompatible with PAROS either, because both share the ultimate objective of ensuring that space is secure for peaceful uses by all countries. That's really what PAROS is aiming at the end of the day. And finally, and very importantly, this new framing is not charged with connotations of a legally binding or non-binding approach. It simply doesn't have that political baggage of 40 plus years that PAROS carries with it. So this is one of many suggestions, one of many possible suggestions for updating the framing. And I look forward to the discussion on this. But I want to get to another issue, which is how do we define success? As elsewhere in PAROS, we often equate consensus outcome documents with success. This obviously allows competition between the space powers to influence results to a great degree, and as we've heard in Almudena's presentation, this has often prevented the adoption of consensus outcome documents. But as you mentioned, the GGE on further practical measures for PAROS last year adopted a consensus report and managed to do so because it didn't seek consensus on all parts of the report, treating it more as a repository of ideas and proposals. This greatly reduces the influence of relations between the space powers, and it helps us keep useful ideas on record. So in short, success can mean more than consensus. We can look at things like, did the process discuss how to develop concrete measures for addressing space threats? For example, tasking a panel of technical experts to develop operational standards on proximity operations. But also, was there diversity among countries in terms of geography, development, spacefaring, non-spacefaring? Were different views represented? Was speaking time distributed fairly, irrespective of delegation size? And were delegates able to benefit from experts through presentations and side events? And finally, in addition to the approach that I presented, the paper includes 8 priorities for PAROS processes that states should consider. And in the paper, each comes with a concrete action that states could take under that priority to make it even more hands-on and actionable for folks reading the paper. And I just want to briefly highlight 4 of these priorities. Space industry needs assurance that space will be secure for peaceful users. But industry also has influence on what we consider as safe, secure, and sustainable. And industry provides services like space situational awareness and cybersecurity, all of which can help to address certain space threats. For these reasons, there should be regular dialogue with industry in PAROS processes. Secondly, the complementarity of space safety, security, and sustainability has often been acknowledged, but we haven't really gotten much out of that complementarity because of concerns about preserving the mandates of COPUOS and PAROS bodies. And I think that that really doesn't need to be so. There should be regular exchange between Vienna and Geneva, because if PAROS bodies were better informed about existing and new outcomes in COPUOS, if anything, it would help to prevent the duplication of work, and it would help to prevent interference with the mandates. In addition to that, I think that states should consider which guidelines adopted in COPUOS could contribute to space threat reduction measures, looking at the LTS guidelines, the space debris mitigation guidelines, and the language that's in there that could be helpful to PAROS. At the moment, PAROS processes quite poorly reflect developments in space defense. At the same time, there is a concerning disconnect in the language that some states use when they talk about PAROS and when they talk about space defense. So states should better coordinate between their MFAs and MODs to ensure that their positions are consistent. And PAROS bodies should receive regular briefings from officials and experts about developments in space defense. And very finally, when UN processes are blocked or slowed by political tensions, as happened with the OEWG this year, maintaining other avenues for substantive talks is important. So that's why states should invest in NGOs that provide dialogue platforms, especially because NGOs can often bring different stakeholders together in a way that states and international organizations cannot. So I will leave it here and return the floor back to Elena. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. It was just a quick glimpse, short glimpse into the paper and its suggestions. There are obviously more recommendations there, and I would encourage everyone to refer and read the publication itself. But now we want to maybe have a little bit of a discussion with Noelle and Simon about some of the suggestions that were made in the paper and tease out their views. I'll start with Noelle. Noelle, Louis suggested that lack of consensus on PAROS should not hold states back from adopting measures that help to reduce space threats. Do you see a possibility for groups of states to develop mechanisms that address specific threats? For example, a commitment not to perform unauthorized rendezvous and proximity operations?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Again, congratulations on the 2 papers, and it's really great to have these ideas out there on record, and it will fully inform the conversations that are happening now. And I agree that it is possible. I'm actually, when I heard it, I was saying, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking. It's possible to agree one by one, maybe start not necessarily unilaterally. Like some states may not have that status to start a conversation unilaterally and then engage others to agree with them. but maybe start bilaterally, as you mentioned, one by one, a state with common interest with another state on a common issue. And easy issues would be on the TCBMs that are contained in the report that was agreed by consensus. One example would be on sharing of information. I understand some sharing of information will have also its own nuances, and some states may have this level of information that they would want to share that are not acceptable to another state. But nevertheless, I believe it's possible to find that at least that one state where you share your common interests, you can commonly agree that we'll have this rule among the two of us, and then spread that understanding. And as more common understanding is reached, and then more can join that agreement, and then have it multilateralized, as you mentioned earlier. So I'm positive that it can be done, because getting to a consensus is difficult, as was outlined earlier, and as we experienced in the OEWGs and even in the GGE. As you mentioned, it mentions there that not all experts agree on the recommendations. I was there in the GGE discussions, and it was a difficult, even sometimes painful discussion getting to that consensus decision. And the end, it was actually a buzzer beater for us, but we did it, but with that disclaimer that not all experts. So I agree, start it small, one by one, and then grow. Thanks.
Thank you. No, but I do have a couple more questions to you. First, the Philippines has become one of the most active participants in space security discussions. Maybe you could explain a little bit why this is a priority for you and your country as an emerging spacefaring nation. What are the commonalities and differences in how states across the global south approach space security?
It is very important for us. Like many space emerging nations, we just institutionalized our space agency recently. Ours was born in 2019, and our Philippine Space Act contains our space policy, national space policy, and it mentions there that the Philippines will grow its space industry, and it will use space, the space uses, to push development, and we aim to be a spacefaring nation, maybe an advanced spacefaring capable nation within the next 10 years. So it's important for us to be joining the discussion. Traditionally, this discussion were with only the advanced spacefaring nations, but with this mandate in our national space law, it's important for us to be joining the conversation so we can be part of the shapers of the policy that will also inform our domestic policy. We're also at the same time now still growing, developing our legal frameworks for specialized space activities. And as we're growing that, we're also aware of the many threats or risks involved in space exploration and use of space assets and use of space data and technology. So for us, it's important to be joining the international conversations at the same time, growing our space programs and frameworks that will be compliant or up to the standards of the global standards.
Thank you, Noelle. But what I want to maybe say, to ask you to say a little bit more about the commonalities and differences across the global south on space security issues, but also kind of attached to that, another question that space security and peaceful uses of space are sometimes framed as separate topics. But for developing countries, peaceful uses are a priority. How do you see their relationship, and could their relationship be leveraged to engage even more global south countries on space security?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And from our experience and observation, countries in the global south will share more uses of space in the civil aspect. Like, for example, the Philippines, it was just only recently that we recognized in our national security policy, which is a published document, the space domain as a domain that we need to also, that is part of our national security strategy. Because for the Philippines traditionally and even now, like most of our neighbors, our global south co-countries, space is used for civil aspects, and it is used, for example, for scientific pursuits, and it will not flourish. Those kinds of uses will not flourish in an environment that will be full of threats and risks. And it is important for us because these scientific pursuits also form part of our policy, and they form part of the basic services. For example, we use space data for disaster management, use space data for climate change adaptation, and many others. And it's important for us to keep that space domain secure and to keep that open access for us, like other global south countries, because it's important for our national development and improvement of the lives of our people, nations. And I think that can be used, sorry, add one more. And I think that can be used as a leverage, because as we share these commonalities with others, I mentioned earlier, we just had, or I don't think I mentioned earlier, but we just recently, we had a webinar with the Brazil Space Agency where we shared uses of space data for protecting or surveying our biodiversity. Both of our countries were very rich in our environmental biodiversity, and it is our common interest to protect those. And in that webinar, we discussed, or we shared how we are using space technology to survey and to protect them and to form policy that will be for the interest of our nations to grow and to protect that and to use it for our national interest.
Yeah, thank you for providing also this example. Yeah, indeed, there's so many different applications in nowadays that space related, based in space on space assets. But I'm going to move now to Simon and pose him a couple of questions. First of all, reflecting on your time as a diplomat in Geneva during the open-ended working group on reducing space threats. What should be the next steps to build on the discussion in this group? And what element of the discussions do you think has the biggest potential for agreement among states?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Elena. One of the most important reflections from my time working on the Responsible Space Behaviours Initiative that led to that OEWG on reducing space threats was how it galvanized interest in space security from a much wider set of countries than we had seen previously. One of the most important aspects of that open-ended working group was its educational nature, and a large number of states attended and benefited from the expert discussions on a really great range of topics. And I think it really opened their eyes to what was at stake with space security and why it was relevant to everyone, to every state. And I think a lot of credit is due to the chair of that process, Helmut Lagos. So on one level, my hope for the current OEWG is that at least that continues to be the case. It continues to fulfill this education function and this means of informing all states about the threats of space security and maintaining those levels of interest. Keeping the conversation going might sound a little bit pessimistic, but I think actually it's really important. And that's why the arguments over the procedural issues that slowed the start of this OEWG up were a bit disappointing. Again, kind of keeping it quite high level, I think one thing that states should be able to agree on is the consequences of a breakdown of security in space, such that space systems, stop working, and they need and the fact that it's really important to identify the threats to space systems and to discuss how to prevent those threats from happening. I don't believe, as I think some of the previous speakers have been saying, I don't believe it's possible to have kind of one comprehensive instrument coming out of the OEWG or these discussions on space security. It will have to be the kind of building blocks approach that Almu was talking about, also that Noelle was talking about. I think it's possible that the OEWG could ultimately start focusing in on certain topics, and I have to say that if you take the politics away, my choice would be rendezvous and proximity operations. I think that's a topic that is really important. But the problem is it's quite a hard security topic, and there are differences of opinion around how to define proximity and stuff like that. But so that's why I really like Louis' suggestion of perhaps trying to take that kind of out of the politics and perhaps passing the discussions to a technical group to start with. I think that's a really good suggestion. And then finally, I think if I could take a step out of the OEWG, I think lots of people are saying this, but I think we really need to find an international coordination mechanism on space traffic management and better sharing of data. The first line of defense for keeping space secure and sustainable is to have that better management of space assets. So I think someone really needs to step up to do this. I think the question is where the best place for it is. I think probably the OEWG may not be the best place because it's more of a Vienna issue. But I think the OEWG can play an important role in talking about these types of issues, and also, recognizing that when we talk about space security now, we also have to talk about the safety and sustainability aspects, and vice versa. So, yeah, various ways that the OEWG could go. But my main message is keeping the show on the road and keeping it as a forum for everyone to be discussing and learning about this important topic.
Right, and that's one of the recommendations, and there is indeed a role for the non-governmental organizations in that as well, as Louis' paper suggests. But what I'm gonna, I'm also looking at your own organization and your dialogue and workshops that you organize. But I have another question for you, Simon. The paper suggests that a new framing for space security effort should be around the protection of peaceful uses of space. Do you think there is a merit in exploring a new framing? Is it better corresponds to today's situation in space? And maybe it could help for us to move beyond the competition between the two legacy approaches to PAROS. And what could be considered, kind of how do you actually develop further that framing and introduce it into the process?
Yes, I do think there is merit in exploring a new framing. And I certainly think that there is a need to move beyond the two opposing approaches that we've heard a lot about already, because they're so dominated by politics, and also because I think the whole kind of PAROS construct has become quite outdated. It's easier said than done, though. Because the chances of trying to perhaps to reframe the PAROS agenda item, if you like, will be very difficult if you wanted to change it in the Conference on Disarmament, for example. The consensus rule there makes it very difficult. You could perhaps do it through the UN General Assembly. Another problem, I think, with reframing it as peaceful uses is of course in the title, because there's been this decades-old dichotomy, division between Geneva work and Vienna work, and people guard that very closely. You know, Geneva work is on security, Vienna work is on peaceful uses. So I think you would have to overcome that that kind of very rigid approach that many people still believe in. However, one thing I would say, and based on my experience, one thing that we tried to do with the UK's initiative on responsible space behaviours was to change the narrative, and in a sense to change the framing. And so we did manage to do that. So that sets a good precedent. One word of caution would be it's only relatively recently that framing came in. So to try and change it again, I think is perhaps maybe a bit too soon, but I think there's definitely precedent there for it. And then finally, how would you do it? I think for it to be successful, it would need a lot of buy-in from a broad range of countries. And I think particularly the emerging spacefaring countries would need to lead it, the small and medium-sized spacefaring countries. I think if they were in the lead on this, and then they got the buy-in from the more advanced spacefaring nations, then it would stand a chance. So I think it's worth exploring. I think, you know, everything in the current climate is difficult. I've said why I think it might be challenging, but definitely worth exploring.
Thank you, Simon. And maybe one more quick question before we move to Q&A and questions from the audience. You, as was already mentioned, that GCSP conducts a number of these meetings and discussions. And what are the key kind of learnings that takeaways from this discussion that could be useful also for moving forward? But I'm also interested in your view, what we could borrow from other fields. For example, the discussion of nuclear risk reduction, or from the little autonomous weapon systems. Is there something that space and security discussions could benefit from?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot I could say on both of those, but I'll try and keep it brief. So the GCSP's space security dialogues, I think one of the key things we discussed in both, we have had 2 sessions so far. One of the key things we've discussed is what we call defining the problem, because many experts believe that particularly the major spacefaring nations are not on the same page about what the problem is, and they keep talking past each other. So we focused on that quite a lot, focusing in on better understanding each state's threat perceptions, and on what they wanted to avoid happening. We were asking, what do we not want to happen in space, as a way of thinking about what the problem is. Another is that we should take a holistic approach to space. We can't talk about security without talking about safety and sustainability, and the other way around. One area which I think will be very important to this discussion in the future, and we had a session on this in our most recent dialogue, is verification. You know, traditionally it's fallen foul to arguments over whether a legally binding treaty to ban the placement of weapons can ever be verified, many arguing that it's neither possible to define a weapon nor to verify if something in space is a weapon. However, I think with emerging technology, with the developments there, I think a more advanced discussion of verification is possible. And I think that's something that we certainly should be using the intergovernmental processes to look at, but also NGOs as well. And I think that we had an idea, I guess similar to Louis' one, was to have a technical and scientific group to kind of look at this and to see how verification could be used in the future. Then I'm going quickly because I'm conscious of time. Just on your question about where else we could look for precedents and examples. I mean, obviously the nuclear domain is an obvious area to look at. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is the P5 process. I think a lot of us think that the P5 process, should it ever get up running again properly, should have space security on its agenda. And I think that could have a very important risk reduction function, especially if there was an element of military to military dialogue in it. Then I think you can look at some of the other processes. I mean, you mentioned laws. I mean, on the whole, work on AI in the military domain in the moment, a lot of work is happening outside the formal intergovernmental processes, the Re-Aim Summit and the US political declaration. There could be more of that, particularly, if you're trying to get around the constraints of the consensus rule and you want to build coalitions of states to lead on certain issues like Noelle was talking about. And, I think I would actually point to the Irish political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas as one potential example of a process that is entirely outside of everything. And they took an issue that was stuck in the intergovernmental realm, and they came up with something that they got a broad range of states to sign up to. I think that's a very interesting case study. I could go on, Elena, but I'll stop there.
Maybe we'll just schedule a separate seminar webinar with you. We'd be happy to continue the conversation. But we promised we'll take some questions from the audience. And I apologize in advance because I realize that we probably won't be able to pose all the questions and get the answers. But Simon, you were already mentioning the definition of weaponization, the issue about verification. And one of the questions that I think is essential to answer right away is, can you say whether there are weapons in space now and to what extent? This is a good question coming from the audience. And then does the discussion in our seminar or overall, where we have that discussion about the definition of the term weapon when it comes to space? So that's question number one. I'm looking for volunteers to answer that. But I think one question though specifically probably I would pose to Almudena. What is the legal significance of unilateral declarations stating that a state will not conduct DA-SAT testing? But first, anyone would like to chime in and say, do we have weapons in space? Yeah, Almudena, okay.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. I think we can definitely say that counter-space capabilities are being developed, have been tested, in some cases have been used. And I would actually direct you to a wonderful report that's published annually, which is the counter-space capabilities reports by the Secure Foundation. This year's report was edited by Victoria Sampson and Leticia Sari, both of whom are wonderful researchers. So I highly, highly recommend that you look at this report. Because of the issue of the difficulty of defining what a weapon is, it's very difficult to actually pinpoint whether we do or we do not have weapons, because we have this dichotomy of, are we looking just at capabilities or are we looking at behaviors and how we use those capabilities essentially? And in fact, a lot of my research has been focused on the issue of what I call dual purpose objects. Dual purpose objects are space objects developed for entirely benign purposes, such as active debris removal, on-orbit servicing, objects capable of conducting rendezvous and proximity operations. But because of the capabilities that they possess to perform these activities, so they might have a robotic arm to conduct those on-orbit servicing operations. They might have a net or a harpoon to catch debris. Those capabilities could be repurposed to harm another satellite instead of for those benign uses. And so, in essence, they would be turned into weapons. And this is a huge concern for a lot of states, even though the number of dual purpose objects is actually not that high. If you look at the whole variety of space systems that we have out there, these dual purpose objects don't make a huge percentage. But still, as we have more and more objects out there, and especially the commercial industry becomes more and more active, these dual purpose objects are developed primarily by commercial entities, this becomes a greater concern. And that's why we have to have these conversations between states and also non-governmental actors such as industry operators regarding what is being placed in outer space and what is the intent behind the development of space technologies. And the more knowledge that we have about space objects, where they are, what the intent behind the use is, the easier it will be to verify and monitor the activities that are conducted with these objects, and the less threatened states might feel by these objects, because a lot of threat perception is actually subjective. It comes from the fact that we might know what is up there, but we don't necessarily know why it is up there. So a very long response to a very short question. But I do want to highlight that this issue of what is a weapon is very complicated because this whole dual purpose nature of certain space systems.
Yeah, it looks like it would be tough to agree on the exact terminology on that. But anyway, do you want also to take the question about the significance of unilateral declarations?
Absolutely. Very
Or
glad to do that.
Simon, would you like to, maybe we'll hold on that because I saw Simon hands. Do you want to add to the previous question?
I can do, or I can take the next one. I don't mind, up to you.
Okay, then Almudena, why don't you focus on the question on the unilateral declarations and their significance?
Sure, happy to do that. Before I go into that, I would also again highlight the space security lexicon that I mentioned earlier. I think space weapon is actually one of the terms that we have there, where we explain, why also the difficulty of defining this term. So hopefully this is a helpful resource for those of you that have questions about what these terms mean. I saw one about what is verification as well. So we have verification defined there as well. Although I thought that was from Daniel Porras, who was actually one of the collaborators of the project. So he is better informed than most, maybe on this topic.
I agree. I probably would have asked Daniel if we had the capability now to tell us his views on this topic.
But to go to your question on the legal significance of unilateral declarations. So even though unilateral declarations don't necessarily have to be legally binding, or they could be established as domestic laws, for example. But in terms of international law, a declaration is not something that is legally binding. That doesn't mean that it's not legally relevant, especially when you get an increasing number of states issuing the same declaration. This gains essentially what I would call normative power. And the more states that issue that same declaration, the more normative power it has. And this eventually can build to a level where you have enough state practice and what we call in international law opinio juris, which essentially means the belief that something should be a legal rule or legally binding, and therefore you come up with a result of something becoming customary international law. So that could be a result of these unilateral declarations over time that believe that this, the content of this declaration should actually be legally binding, and therefore becoming thus through custom. It could also, create the idea that because so many states are issuing declarations in the same direction, an issue has become so important that it merits sitting down and negotiating a specific written legally binding agreement. And that can be the case. So it is very relevant because it can lead to law. But even from a policy perspective, it is also very relevant because it signifies to the international community the intent from one specific country regarding their domestic policy, the way they view space activities down the line. And it is a useful way for a state to position themselves as a good actor, especially in this context where we're talking about, responsible behaviors, and there are certain, there are certain actors that have criticized the expression responsible behaviors because it is unclear what this means. From a legal perspective, I have a legal background, so I also dislike, the lack of precise language. So I can understand that criticism, but my take when it comes to the term responsible behaviors is that sometimes just because something is, legally accepted or within the boundaries of the law doesn't necessarily mean that it is good for the space environment. And so you need a high standard.
We got it. Maybe if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt you and stop so that we have only 5 minutes left.
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, we're going to move to another question, and I'm posing it to everyone on the panel, and let me know who wants to take it. And that question was posed not by one, but by at least two individuals. I'm sure others want to hear that as well. I would be interested to hear from the panelists what they think about the recently announced Golden Dome initiative and how it might influence the parents' discussion in the multilateral sphere. Anyone would like to take the floor first? Simon, I'm going to invite you to open that discussion, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm afraid I haven't been in the OEWG discussion, so I would have to defer that one to someone who has been in it. But perhaps if I might just really quickly comment on the first question about are there weapons in space? I mean, when I was in the meetings, I used to think that this was the elephant in the room, because I used to think to myself, why are we not answering this question? Because it's something that states actually have been very cautious about answering, and I think my personal belief is that there are weapons in space, or at least things in space that could be used as weapons. And then on the unilateral declarations, of course, they function a bit like moratoria, and that is another toolkit in the disarmament toolkit that can be a step towards a legally binding instrument like the CTBT, for example. But I'm afraid I don't feel as if I could answer the question about what's been discussed in the OEWG, because unfortunately I wasn't there.
Great. Anyone else would like to chime in? Louis, do
Yeah.
you have any?
Perhaps I'll just say very quickly, it's obviously a controversial issue that has been raised, or a controversial development for many countries involved in the PAROS process. I would probably just at the beginning of that highlight that experts, including many US experts and leading scientists on the topic, have significant doubts about whether the plans that have been sort of teased by the administration are feasible at all, and whether the system that they propose would be able to deliver the kind of protection that they claim it could. There's also big question marks around the cost of it. So all of these are still unknowns, and my last sort of status update was that the Pentagon hasn't actually yet released the detailed plans for the kinetic missile interceptors that are supposed to be placed in space under this plan. Having been at the OEWG meeting in July, granted I didn't follow every word, but I cannot recall the United States having spoken on Golden Dome, or having made a statement about this. I think there's still restructuring and reorientation going on in the State Department, and so they perhaps weren't in a position to address other states on that topic. But it certainly goes back to one of the key issues in PAROS, which is that the initial Soviet proposals for banning weapons in space were partly informed by a wish to preempt US plans for missile interceptors in space that were first sort of thought of in the Reagan administration. So this has obviously, I think, raised this concern yet again very powerfully for Russia, but also for China, because the sort of the promise, even though there are still doubts, is that it could make the United States less vulnerable to other countries' nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it's a big question to tackle, but we ran out of time. But if you don't mind, maybe just the last question to all of you, and literally, if you have something to say, like 30 seconds answer. How do you ensure we protect essential services in space from being targeted or impeded in conflict? This is a very relevant kind of real life question. And how do we ensure space access is maintained for all countries when there is a conflict? Anyone would like to take the floor? Just unmute yourself. Yeah, Almudena first, Noelle second.
Sure. Very quickly, I think the whole issue of targeting is especially an issue when it comes to dual use objects. Dual use meaning objects that have both military and civilian functions, such as, for example, communications satellites or Earth observation satellites. So non-aggressive military uses, but still they help optimize military operations on Earth, and are also essential for civilians for, access to internet, etc. And so again, I would say more information about these objects is essential to know what the impact of potentially targeting those objects can be, especially for civilians. And more information would lead to an increased protection of civilians, because it can help the assessment that a belligerent has to conduct when applying international humanitarian law principles of proportionality, distinction, etc. And that information can actually be provided when registering objects through the registration convention. The information requirements by law under the registration convention are very, very general and very basic. And it is voluntary for states to provide more information. So I would encourage them to actually do so. The commercial industry is actually a huge example of how this can be done. And companies such as, for example, Astroscale from Japan, they always provide extra information when they launch their missions. And I think that's something that others, and especially states, can emulate. And that would make space safer and more secure, and eventually more sustainable as well.
Thank you, Almudena. Noelle?
I was going to answer similar to that we have to exchange information, be open in sharing, more open. Transparency is very important, so that we will be aware on what are these essential services and reach that common understanding that we all have common interests that we have to protect. And for that also, I agree with the earlier suggestion that we should treat PAROS discussions as building blocks and not one zero slate each time. So in that manner, we can continue to keep the to keep pursuing that, achieving that common understanding on what we need to be protecting. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Simon or Louis, on that issue? If not, if you want to add something else as your last words, please, this is an opportunity.
Perhaps just to say, I completely agree with what Alma and Noelle were saying. I mean, I think trying to define what essential services are will make coming to an agreement on this very difficult. But we do need to find ways of having that conversation, and also thinking about the consequences of conflict on space systems and what that means on Earth. We very much need to continue the conversation about how about what would happen and how we would respond to it.
Thank you. Louis, I'll give you the final word before we close the webinar.
Thank you, Elena. Well, on this issue, I would perhaps just say space is such a unique environment. And it's so difficult to make sure that targeting one object doesn't cause damage to another object. For example, as we've seen, using DA-ASAT weapons and destroying objects in space creates a lot of debris that then poses a really serious threat to other space objects. And there's just no way to control where that debris is going to go. So if anything, that should underline that we need to prevent conflict in outer space with the utmost urgency. And thank you so much for tuning in to our webinar today.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone. And those patients also that stayed with us till the end. Encourage you to read the papers and tune and sign up for newsletters so that we can bring you more discussions like that. We'd be happy to. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, our panelists. And thank you, UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for the support. Thank you.